Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review the second episode of Superman and Lois. There's a lot going on in this episode, so hopefully I can get it all correct, because I might get it jumbled. Because when looking at it, here's when we start to get really everyone finding their footing in a new environment. We end up having it to where ultimately Jonathan is going to go on his own journey of discovering where he's going to end up in Smallville. We end up having Jordan having his own discoveries. Lois Lane is going to try to adjust to not exactly being in Metropolis anymore, and we end up having it to where Clark is desperately looking for someone with answers. And that I think is the most interesting thing going on within this episode. I think really everybody adjusting to a new environment. Because ultimately, even you could say it's like, well, Clark has spent years upon years at Smallville. I'm like, yeah, but when also looking at it, he had spent years and years in Metropolis. So looking at it, like going into Smallville isn't exactly something that you can like you can just put the training wheels on and everything will be fine because uh, Clark didn't have a wife and kids in Smallville, and at the like he didn't have any of that. So when looking at it, like he's adjusting to like, okay, now I'm back in Smallville, a place that I'm familiar with, but how am I gonna juggle like family and fighting basically being Superman? How am I going to be able to balance act all of these things and ultimately have everything turn out okay? I'm gonna have to pause here for a second. All right. So with this show, we end up having it to a reasonably. We get a big Easter egg in this one. We get to go, okay, what is really and truly this version of Superman in this show? Like, I think when really looking at it, we had a lot of times where we were thinking that this show was really just going to piggyback off of like every single thing that Supergirl had done. Like that's what I think a lot of people were already assessing that it's like, oh, well, this is going to be this version of Superman to us. And ultimately like no, like they're going to change things. So ultimately, for people who do not know, I'm going to be talking about some stuff from episode one to tie us into this episode a little bit. So, if you haven't seen episode one, I am going into spoilers, even right into this cryptic session. So be aware of that. So if you don't know, go into episode one of me talking about the show, and ultimately you can do any number of things. You can ultimately go into the CW app and watch this show for absolutely free, or ultimately go into any other kind of movie app of whatever and watch this for free. Because ultimately it's a really good show. I'm really liking it. I don't care that it's slow. I think that it's simple but effective. Like I think it's a really good show so far. I think that there has to be some kind of hook or something where ultimately people are going to be like, well, what's going to happen next week? And I think that this show delivers that. Every single episode, they have some kind of hook, they have some kind of cliffhanger thing. Just be like, well, I want to know more now. Like, I think that's what happens every single end of every episode. So I think that that's the good thing about this episode is it kind of gives you leaving of like, man, I want to watch next week. I want to see what happens. So going into this, we have people that like Jordan and Jonathan. I could really see that the son becomes the father in these episodes. Like I feel when looking at it, Jonathan and Jordan are going into this town and being treated just how Clark was. Where there was a lot of times where Jordan in this episode was kind of there was some suspicious moments of people questioning Jordan a lot. We end up having it to where like Jonathan is kind of being treated how Clark was in some episodes, and so on and so forth. And there's a lot of times where I kind of was just like, man, like this is like the sons of Clark are just his spitting image. Like basically, it's just like, hey, we can't go through and have young Clark again, so or he's in high school or whatever, so we'll just do that through his kids. That's what this episode kind of felt like. So, if anything, that's all that I'm going to say about this, and let's get into spoilers about this episode. Um, Reasonably, they do some odd things. What was to be revealed with the last episode, which is to have had Lex in this episode. And they do some odd things, I think, at the tail end of this episode, which I thought was like, okay, this is a very left field approach to Lex in this show. I was like, okay, odd approach, weird. I also thought that going into here that there were some times that I thought that there were some moments that were good, but then again, I was like, okay, this is kind of a smaller approach to some Easter eggs going into here. I thought like there was some kind of smaller rungs of things that ultimately I was just like, man, you had this big Easter egg, but it kind of didn't feel all that great. It kind of didn't feel... So let's go into the feels. Let's ultimately go into the spoilers, because ultimately there's only so many ways that I could break this down. Go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about the time we spoil this episode. So we ultimately have it to where we kind of have to burst this into several different things going on within this episode. So I ultimately might have to do it through 4 different kind of slivers of episode, where we ultimately have the Clark time, we have the Jonathan time, the Jordan time, and the Lois time. And then eventually whoever additional characters we'll have in here. So I'll have to break it down into like 4 parts for this episode. So let's ultimately go into Jonathan first. So we ultimately have it to where Jonathan is ultimately going to new school. We ultimately find out that Jordan is going to be haltered on going back to school, because ultimately they're thinking, well, maybe we'll just homeschool you, because yeah, Jordan has superpowers right now, and we have to kind of really test to see uh, like what is going on with Jordan. So we end up having it to where Jonathan is going to school, but bizarrely it seems that he wasn't mailed or delivered his playbook for his football team. So he won't know any of the plays, and he'll just go in and just try to be a quick study or just try to figure things out. We ultimately have it to where eventually Jonathan goes to school, and it seems that Jordan's questionable lip locking girl, I'm just going to keep calling her the Lana Lang girl, the Lana Lang daughter, because that's normally what I would just call her anyways. I think her name is Sarah, but I could be wrong. But maybe I'll just keep calling her Sarah until someone corrects me. So we end up having it to where, let's just say Sarah, I guess, because that's who I'm assuming that this person might be. So Sarah ends up going and greeting Jonathan, and she's like, well, hey, where's Jordan? And ultimately, Jonathan just says, oh, hey, yeah, he's sick. And so ultimately, that's why he's home. But bizarrely later, we eventually find Jordan ends up going and greeting a bunch of people, and then Sarah's like, well, I thought you were sick. And Jordan says, oh no, like, I got better fairly quickly. And so Sarah's like, okay, that's weird. So we end up having it to where ultimately Jonathan goes into this school. It seems like the only friend that he knows is seemingly Sarah, because we end up finding it that the football team is going to be treating Jonathan like crap. I'm like, God, this is the most like stereotypical like school approach to like, oh, the jock uh has to put the new kid, like has to put the boots to the new kid, just has to treat him like crap because he's the new kid. Uh, so we end up having it to where Jonathan is to go on the field and ultimately play with his football friends that aren't really his friends at all. They're just his other football guys. So we end up having it to where Jonathan ends up saying, like, hey, like, I'm a real quick study. Like, how about I go on the field and I uh, just start playing around with the pigskin kind of thing. So we end up having it to where the coach ultimately is going like, okay, sure, like go ahead. So we end up having it to where this quarterback ends up kind of messing up one of the plays, and then eventually we end up having it to where uh, one of the players ends up knocking the wind out of Jonathan, ultimately saying like, "Yeah, we have that quarterback position already filled." Basically saying like that either one, Jonathan is gonna have to win these people over, or two, like he's just going to like get freaking be just like Clark, where ultimately like people have to put him in his place consistently because he's the new kid. But ultimately we have it to where so Jonathan is taking all of the brunt that Jordan had done in the very first episode by kissing Sarah, and so now Jordan is having to forcibly be, or Jonathan is having to forcibly be miserable because of what Jordan had done in the previous episode. So we end up having it to where Jonathan is not happy. He's going to have to forcibly be the person that is Skyping his girlfriend and like just kind of talking about things, talking things out. But ultimately, he's just miserable. We ultimately have to, or forcibly, Lois is going to have to comfort him and say, like, you know what? I know that you had given up everything to come here. And ultimately, we have it to where, in vice versa, Jonathan is ultimately saying, well, Lois, like, you gave up everything to come here too, so why should I complain? But we end up having it to where eventually Jordan comes to Jonathan and ultimately like tries to apologize for all the stuff that he had done as well and try to comfort his brother and like try to make amends. We eventually have it to where let's talk about Jordan. So ultimately we have it to where Clark and Jordan ultimately are to go to the Fortress of Solitude, which was like, yeah, like I was wondering if they were gonna do it like early or if they were gonna do anything like if it was just gonna be a Smallville adventure this whole entire time. But at least we've set up early the Fortress of Solitude to ultimately have it to where maybe quite possibly Jordan or Jonathan or Clark could take either one of the kids to the Fortress of Solitude. Like, I think it would be nice if Clark should have actually sent, like, both sons to the Fortress of Solitude to learn the Fortress of Solitude stuff. Like, you would have thought that Clark would have just said, hey, like, I'm going to both take you to the Fortress of Solitude at some point. And, like, you would have thought that Clark would have eventually taken Jonathan to learn everything about Superman-ish, like, stuff. But he didn't. Like, I think that whole, like, Jordan being excluded from that also just kind of made him upset as well, of just being like, well, hey, Superboy and Superman, like, go ahead on your journeys as I'm excluded from all of that to ultimately I can't have fun. Like, I have to be miserable going to a school that people hate me and fear me, hate and fear me, because who knows what's going to happen with Jonathan at some point when he eventually probably becomes a Superboy, I'm assuming. So, going on into here, so we have it to where Kal-El ultimately comes up as Obi-Wan Kenobi, Grandpa is what Jordan calls him. And so we end up finding out that ultimately Kal-El or Jor-El is going to test Jordan, and ultimately find out that it seems that the cup doesn't exactly runneth over for Jordan. We end up having it to where Jor-El ends up talking to Clark and ultimately mentioning, yeah, your son, Jordan, really not that powerful. Really just seems like he might have little blips here and there of power, but that's about it. He won't fully fledgedly become the Superman that ultimately Clark had become. So we end up having it toward Jordan because, heaven forbid, you have Jordan going out into the cold to avoid his test results. Like Jor-El is like his doctor. Like, you tested negative for power, you tested negative for flying, you tested negative for anything. So we end up having it to where Jordan is just crushed, that he finds out that he is never going to be the daddy, I guess. If you like in bizarrish talk show like terms, he is not going to be the man with power. So we ultimately have it to where Clark is just ultimately just going, "Oh, I'm sorry. Like, I didn't realize that you were there." I'm sorry that I didn't realize that you were there in the Fortress of Solitude as well as I was. And you could have heard this stuff because you were like 5 feet away. My bad. My bad. So we end up having it to where, like, we really have it to where Lois, like, her kids are, like, erupting at the same time. To where ultimately Lois has to forcibly comfort both Jordan and Jonathan, because we end up having it to where Clark is just really not a good father. He's really not a good father. Like, towards the end of this episode, he does quite try and comfort them, but ultimately he's just not doing a good enough job. Like, it feels like Clark is so disconnected with the dad role. It's ridiculous. And these kids are like teenagers, and it doesn't really feel like, I guess you can ultimately say that Clark has just been so severely disconnected from his sons because he's never really been there for them because he's been off being Superman, that, like, but it's so telling that Clark just doesn't feel like a dad at all in this show so far. Like, it's such a disconnect. It's ridiculous. So we end up having it to where Lois ends up having to try and comfort Jordan for not having the abilities or the powers that he was quite possibly thinking that he was going to have. Like, it's hard to live up to a man that is Superman and to hear the the real truth that, like, you will never become like a Superman. Like, you will never be that. Like, but you're related to a person, but you're not going to have that power. So we end up having it to ultimately, so Clark ends up having to go on his journey to eventually go and fight off the Lex of this episode. So we end up having it to where eventually Clark has to go off, and we find that this Lex is ultimately desperately searching for kryptonite. He is searching for any kind of form of kryptonite to simply eventually power his suit, or eventually, like, to also kill Clark or Superman. So we eventually have it uh, to where Lex is going out of his way to find kryptonite, but all he's finding is guns, and ultimately he is trying to get kryptonite out of this dealer that doesn't have any kryptonite. And so eventually we have it to where Clark ends up finding uh, said Lex and ends up trying to intercept him and try to take him down. But it seems that eventually we end up finding out that Lex uses his ship as a way of just going like, okay, well, my ship has a bomb on it. You're gonna go and have to stop my ship or stop me. Choose Superman. And so we end up having it to where Superman ends up trying and taking Lex's ship and flying it off into orbit, and then eventually trying to avoid this explosion. But eventually he gets hit and eventually he ends up going back into orbit and crashing into part of Earth. I'm like, dude, they basically did almost the exact same thing in the very last episode. What are they gonna like? Is that like this Superman's calling card of him having to like be in orbit somewhere and then eventually like smash back into the Earth? Like, is that just gonna be or barely like in the first episode he barely almost crashed into Earth, where in the second one he ends up crashing into Earth? Like, what is that? Is that going to be like every single episode? Like, Clark is going to have to go to outer space for something and then have to, like, come back and be damaged? Like, is that going to be, like, every single thing? That's going to be a goofy thing that they're going to have to do every single episode. I hope that they kind of stay away from that after this episode. They've gone to that well too many times now. Twice now. Then that's too many. Try to do something different with this ship. Like try to throw it in a volcano or something. I don't know. Just do something different. Like that ultimately, like I don't know. Just do something with it. Just put it in the icy waters. Put it in the Atlantic Ocean. That'll be fine. Um, but anyways, so we end up having it to where this Lex ultimately evades the Superman. And so we eventually have it to where Lex is going to come up with a second battle, but we'll get to that. So, what happens with the low lane? What happens with the low in this episode? Well, ultimately, Lois is to ultimately go to this town meeting. Ultimately, see what's kind of brewing for this town. It seems like Lois is gonna like. I would assess that I think Lois Lane should become like some political figure. Like we had it to where ultimately like Superman's mother in Smallville had become like some like senator or whatever. Like why not have Lois Lane actually become like some political figure of Smallville? Like I think that that would actually make a lot of sense. Like I don't know what's going on with Lois in the most current iteration of her character, but like I think it would be cool if she was like a government official of sorts, like a governor or something. I don't know. But anyways, so we end up having it to where Lois ends up going to this town meeting, and Morgan Edge ends up coming to this town meeting to say like all the improvements that he had supposedly made with the town, but then eventually Lois ends up going like, well, yeah, that sounds like all great improvements, but then also you've kind of like done some wrongdoings as well. You've kind of fired some people and gotten rid of some things. So we end up having going Morgan Edge going, well, yeah, but you know what? Like, aren't I your boss? Like, aren't I your boss? Don't you do the news for me and at the Daily Planet? Like, yeah, you're kind of taking your job and having it be like you're sending me the articles via email or whatever. You're kind of doing your job at home or whatever, but still, you're still writing articles. So we end up having it to where ultimately Lois ends up sending a piece out to ultimately just be berating Morgan Edge, and we have it to where Morgan Edge completely adjusts the article to make it to be some fluff piece to where ultimately Lois doesn't like that at all. She's like, I don't like my words being adjusted, kind of thing. And so we end up having it to where Lois goes all the way to Metropolis to hand Morgan Edge a note that ultimately just says the words, I quit. So we end up having it to where Lois Lane is no longer a Metropolis reporter. While we were at this town meeting, we end up having it to where Lois Lane ends up meeting a person from the Smallville news article worker person. We end up finding out that it seems that this girl was a big fan of Lois Lane's. Ultimately, like, oh my god, you're Lois Lane? Wow, my editor really loves your stuff. So we end up having it to ultimately Lois ends up going like, well, I just quit that other job, so where else am I going to go now? So we end up having Lois going her way uh, to greeting this Smallville news reporter, and ultimately it seems like this entire building that this woman is at is completely empty, and so we end up having it to where Lois Lane ends up saying like, here's the article that I was going to put out there, and Morgan Edge had changed. And so ultimately, we had it to where it's like, well, like, what are you going to do with that article? He won't let you put out that article. It's like, well, I can put that article out here. Hire me. And so we end up having it to where the girl confesses that it's like, well, like, just letting you know, it's like, I don't have an editor, I don't have a janitor, I don't have an anything here. Like, it's just me working here all alone. And like, sure, you're hired, I'll hire you. So we end up finding out that Lois is now working for the news article in Smallville, or the news reporters in Smallville, which is just her and one other person. So like, that'll be a really interesting story. I wonder if they'll eventually get maybe like a Jimmy Olsen or something like that. Because eventually we're eventually gonna have some of those small, or that Supergirl characters eventually make their way probably to this show, because what else are they going to do? So it'll be interesting to see like who will get maybe from the Supergirl show, because that show's over. That'd be kind of nice. Maybe a Jimmy Olsen would be nice. So going on into here, we have it to where, okay, so Lois has her thing, Jonathan has had his thing, Jordan, now Clark. So ultimately we have it to where Clark is ultimately looking for somebody with answers, because we end up having it to where Clark is mentioning in this episode that ultimately Jonathan always had the answer for everything, and so we are ending up having or wanting Clark to really go to somebody that has answers, because ultimately that's all he's ever done. So we end up having it to where ultimately when General Sam is going to give Clark intel on like, hey, yeah, like we had gotten a satellite feed of ultimately Lex's ship, and so now we'll be able to track that thing down. Eventually, that tracking down eventually becomes a bomb of sorts. So we ultimately have it to where Clark spills to General Sam. It's like, hey, I just let my sons know that I'm Superman. And so General Sam ultimately goes and he's like, that is the worst thing that you could have ever done. Like, if anything, I see the toll that ultimately takes on Lois of your secret. All the lies, all the fabrication that she has to do for you. Like, I could see the toll that it's taking on her. And so I don't like it. It's going to tear your family apart. You know what? I honestly think that this secret is actually probably keeping his family. It kind of feels like this secret is actually keeping his family even closer together. I believe, to be brutally honest. Like, I don't feel like it's tearing any of them apart. So I don't quite get exactly where General Sam is talking about here, where it's tearing them apart. Uh, I don't know. To be continued with that notion. So we end up having it to where Clark is just upset about, like, yeah, that's what I was thinking too. I was thinking, don't tell them. But here's the thing: we end up having Clark not telling General Sam that ultimately, hey, Jordan had powers. That's why I had to break my secret. Like, one of my kids has superpowers. And that's why I had to tell him. If ultimately Clark would have said that, that would have been a completely different conversation altogether. Maybe eventually Lois is going to tell General Sam, it's like, hey, shut the F up. Like, Jordan has powers. That's why we had to break the secret. Like, don't be giving Clark so much crap. Like, this guy has saved the planet a bajillion times over, and you're just gonna be like crucial in every little tiny decision that he makes. Like General Sam has in these two episodes really been micromanaging Superman and Clark to a absurd degree. Like we end up having it to where even in this first episode, like Clark is being pulled away from his time in Smallville, where he's trying to adjust, and he is pulled away to go and fight off this Lex person in this metal armor. And we ultimately have it to where when they have it to where I think Lana Lang is throwing yet another get together. God, it seems like every week they're having some like neighbor get together thing. We end up having it to where Jordan, Jonathan are here, and we end up having it to where Sarah is ultimately going, and ultimately is like, "Hey, Jordan, why were you sick?" Jordan says, "I wasn't sick." Sarah's like, "That's weird. Maybe you have superpowers." I know that's why. But we end up having it to where Clark ends up going with this get together, like, yeah, we'll probably just be here for an hour and then we'll probably just have to leave for some reason. So we eventually find out that Clark has to leave because ultimately he hears something from a bajillion miles away. And like I really like the whole like hearing thing that ultimately Clark has to where ultimately he can hear any things from seemingly anywhere. And so like I thought that that was really fascinating. Like Superman is really using this power of just being able to track anybody down by just hearing. It's kind of really interesting. I like that approach. So we ultimately have it to where Clark has to desperately leave to ultimately take down this Lex bot and ultimately go on and tackle Lex. So we end up having it to where Clark is like, I have to leave, and Lois is like, okay, I'll make something up. I'll try to comfort our kids while you're gone for the 800th time. So Clark goes off ultimately to take down uh, this Lex, and so we ultimately have it to where Lex is trying to take down General Sam. He's taking down all of his armored or all of his army guys, and because we find out that Lex is trying to get closer to General Sam to create some kind of dissension between General Sam and Clark. And I thought that this scene was really interesting. We end up having it to where Lex ends up going to General Sam and saying like, "Hey, like we've been through hell together, like you and me, like we have to take down Superman. We have to take him down." And General Sam is ultimately just like, "What are you talking about?" We end up having it to where Lex uh, ends up giving General Sam some dog tags, and we end up having it to where Clark ends up taking Lex down, ending up finding out when Lex tears away the helmet of this Lex that ultimately it's just a bot. That ultimately Lex wasn't even there. He was like a million miles away. We ultimately find that this Lex has a alternate spin on Superman. We end up finding out that Lex is in some old was in some alternate Earth or alternate time period of sorts, where it seems that Superman had gone evil and had uh, taken everybody out in Lex's world, with the exception of course, Lex. So I'm assuming that this Superman might be uh like maybe like a Justice Lord Superman, or maybe this is some variation of Superman that had gone evil, but it looks just like this Superman, with the exception of him being in all black. So I'm like, so in other words, so the Justice League Snyder cut thing ultimately has a Superman in a black suit. So now Superman and Lois has to have a Superman in a black suit. But ultimately, I'm still assessing that reasonably this could be like hell, or some different variation of Superman instead of it actually um, being actual Clark Kent Superman. So eventually we have it to where Lex is ultimately saying like, yeah, like eventually we're gonna have it to where Superman is going to turn bad eventually onto this planet, and Lex is going to be the only saving grace uh, to go up against Superman. So that's kind of how this episode ends, with General Sam looking at the dog tags, Lex saying like, I'm the only saving grace of this planet because this Superman will turn evil. So that's all I have to say for this episode. I'm gonna get out of here. Goodbye everybody. Bye everybody.